Such a good crowd. That was God talking. This is going to be very much an informal conversation. Professor Inazu and I are longtime friends, longtime colleagues, and speaking for myself, I've learned a lot from him and admire his work very well, but I don't expect him to.
The feeling is mutual.
Yeah. And we, among other shared interests we have, First Amendment, criminal law, Jesus. We also both like Duke basketball a lot, so that's another thing.
But John, lamenting together.
Yeah. John is the John and Sally Danforth Professor at WashU. He's both a political theorist and a law professor. He teaches undergrads and law students. He's been very involved in a lot of initiatives around St. Louis and really around the country that kind of promote interfaith dialogue, that promote ways to help lawyers, both senior and junior, think about their vocations, and really has invested himself in building community, including Christian community on the WashU campus and in St. Louis more broadly. He's the author of the technical term is a boatload of law review articles and chapters, and also several books. His first book, which actually grew out of the project that brought us together really, was on the First Amendment's freedom of assembly, the sadly understudied and underutilized freedom that's protected by the First Amendment. And since then, again, he's worked on a number of projects, but this current book, Learning to Disagree, I believe it's your third book, right? Confident Pluralism is the second, is that right? One of the things we might talk about is how all three of these books fit together, but Learning to Disagree is hot off the presses. It's a very accessible, wonderful read, very inspiring. I'd encourage all law students especially to read this book. And I've already asked Dean Cole to make it required reading for next year's first year orientation. So please join me in welcoming John Inazu. So John, I think there's a podcast I listen to which has a lot of interviews with book authors. And there's kind of a consensus that the first thing you want to do when you have a book author is give the book author a chance to say what the book's about. So John, what's your book about?
Thanks, Rick. Thanks for having me. I love being at Notre Dame. We usually find ways to have me up here a couple times a year, so this is great. I love the Morrison. There was a period of years when that was under construction and there was a dumpy second tier option, so it's great to be back in the A game. So what's this book about? It's relevant, I think, to this kind of audience because this is really different than other stuff I've written, and this is much more narrative based. It's sort of the story of law teaching. It turns out like Rick is one of the few people in the country that directly lines up with my teaching. So the first half of the book takes you through the class in criminal law, and the second half takes you through law and religion. And those are two areas that you touch on as well. And the idea was really, I started this book in the middle of COVID when everyone was sort of isolated and alone and shouting at each other across the internet. And I thought we have to figure out better tools of re-engaging and figuring out how to have arguments and hard conversations. And it occurred to me that even though most people think of lawyers as those stubborn people who argue a lot, that good lawyers, all of you and all of my students, actually know that you have to get beyond that and you have to be really good at understanding the other side in the best possible light, all the counter arguments, if only for pragmatic reasons to make your own side better. But the doing of the work to understand the other side's argument is actually a work of empathy, and that skill is translatable to non-legal context. So that's the pitch of the book, sort of story-based format, taking you through a year of an academic law school, hopefully interesting enough to engage the non-lawyers of the world.
So the way this goes through, it kind of unfolds month by month through an academic year, and in each chapter you have kind of a different proposal or take on ways that people can disagree better. And again, you illustrate those different ways by drawing on things that are happening in class and so on. Without making you recite the whole book, what are some of the ways that you propose? It's not enough to call them tips, they're deeper than that, but some of the kind of habits that you urge people to inculcate in order to make disagreements work better. And again, you never suggest that disagreement disappears or even that it should, but you do have a lot of ideas on how to think about what it means to disagree and how to disagree better. So what are some of those?
You've given me too much credit to say the proposals. Each chapter is titled with a question, and the question is sort of meant to leave it a bit open-ended. What happens when we can't compromise? How do we learn empathy? Is forgiveness possible? And my goal is to get you to think about these questions, hopefully with an answer that is optimistic for our society and our lives. But I purposefully set it up as questions because I want this to be more of an engaged experience and less of a didactic, here are the propositions. And part of that reason, we have so many shared commonalities here, but one of them is a mutual love and appreciation for the philosopher Alistair McIntyre, and for deeply McIntyrean reasons. None of this is learnable by going to a TED Talk, right? This is something that you have to cultivate over time in community with practices with other people. And so I'm trying to lure you into that kind of thinking with the strategy of the book.
Can you talk a bit about some of the sort of in-class events or challenges that you sort of use in the book as launching points for some of your advice about how to make disagreement better? I mean, again, in the first half of the book, and all of these folks have taken criminal law, you talked about some things that happen in criminal law, right? A lot of those resonated with me. And you also talked about some things that happen in law and religion. But just what are a couple examples where in the law school setting, there was kind of potential for disagreement to go wrong, and that you learned from that story some of the things that you talk about in the book about how to make disagreement work better?
Yeah, there's a lot of examples to draw from here. I mean, one quick story from the criminal law context is that, and if you don't know this already, anyone who teaches criminal law just debates for a long time about whether to cover sexual assault because it is such a fraught topic and so hard to teach. But I always teach it, and one of the first years that I taught the course, because the issue is so hard and because it touches so many personal lives in the classroom, you have to put a lot of thought and care into how to teach it. And one pedagogical way into it is to start with a case of clear non-consent that it just involves a forcible act. So you don't have to get into the murky questions of consent. And the very first time I'm teaching this class, I set up that case, and then I asked people for their thoughts on it. And there was a male student in the class who just made a completely inappropriate comment about, basically not recognizing the lack of consent. And that set off the class into an eruption. And so you can imagine my first time teaching it, I'm up there trying to figure out what do I do next. I mean, people were walking out of the room, and in the moment it was extremely tense. And this particular guy, I don't mention it in the book, but he did himself no favors by going on social media and doubling down on some of this, so that never, don't do the group meet, don't do social media, keep it in class. And but it was extremely fraught and precarious. But what I learned and I experienced in the moment was we actually then had an entire semester to recover and to keep asking questions and to rebuild trust within the classroom. And that to me is one of the real great privileges and opportunities of being in these environments. You can have these extended conversations over time with the same group of people, with the benefit of having a discussion and then leaving and then coming back to it. And that's just core to good thinking. And eventually, even though that was an out of bounds comment, there are lots of sort of reasonable disagreements that are going to get you emotionally charged, and to have the space to leave and come back to them over time during the course of a semester. It's an incredible privilege. I know it doesn't feel that way when you've got exams around the corner, but it is. I mean, these are not replicable in the rest of life in a lot of ways. So that's one example. And then another thing that comes to mind is I had a student, because in criminal law especially, you encounter students who have certain personal experiences and who where it's just a little too close. So I say to my students, if I'm going to do cold calls in the class, but if there's an issue or a case you can't involve in, just let me know up front. So I had a student come to me right before a drunk driving case, and he asked me not to call on him, and I just made this snap judgment about him. I thought, well, you probably had a DUI in college, and okay, we won't bring that up, and I won't cold call on you. And he came by my office a couple of days later, and this is a story I sort of share in the book. And he said the reason he couldn't do the DUI case is that his sister had been killed by a drunk driver a couple of years before he went to law school. And then, in fact, in the case that made national news, and he had gone into court and pled for leniency for her killer. Because I don't even actually think it was a faith-based reason, but it was that for justice reasons, he couldn't understand why an unintentional killing in that context would warrant this heightened punishment. So he argued in favor of the man who killed his sister. And it was this very profound moment for lots of reasons. I mean, challenging my own stereotypes going in, but also just the richness of what people bring to the classroom from their experience, and knowing like in this semester with this particular student, this was going to be an experience for this class that would never be replicable. So I sort of changed up my syllabus, and the next day I had him and one other student. We just had a discussion about their lives. And I said, you're going to remember this class a lot more than my third class on attempt law in 20 years. And it was remarkable. And it was just a reminder to me that the experience, the challenge, the opportunity of teaching is always dependent on this unique group of people in the rooms. Even though, we might be teaching it for the 6th, 7th, 8th, 24th time, but it's always contingent, and you can't game it out. And there's a lot of risk in that, but there's also a lot of opportunity.
You made a reference just a couple minutes ago, and you also talk about this in the book, that one of the things we do in law school, one of the things that you and I try to teach is this ability of students to understand the other side's argument so as to more effectively be able to engage it, and I guess if we're have a client to defeat it, right? As you know, there's a criticism of law school pedagogy that says something like, it's kind of alienating for students when you tell them all the time, make the argument that X, regardless of whether they believe X, and argue the other side and argue something you don't believe. Again, students sometimes find this alienating. Do you have like a defense of this aspect of legal pedagogy that you could share?
That's your job here. I think it's critical, if for another reason, then you are going to have clients, and maybe some of you will be able to handpick your clients, but most of you won't, and you're going to have to make arguments that you might not agree with. And at some point, you're going to have ethical and personal boundaries to those arguments. I spent 4 years practicing law at the Pentagon, and certainly drew some of my own boundaries during that time. But you have to be able to. I tell my own students, it's kind of like going into the operating room with a surgeon. I don't want my surgeon to be freaked out by blood, right? I want him to be like a really good surgeon. I also want him to be a human being, or her. I want my surgeon to be a human being who cares about me as a person and is really good at the craft. And then the same way, I want my lawyer, or I want the students I train to be lawyers, to be human beings, and also be willing to, in an almost clinical sense, be able to make arguments and detect other arguments, and argue for the other side of an issue. I used to, one of the things I talk about in the book is my own family history, as my dad's side of the family are Japanese Americans who were interned in World War II. And if you want me to make the case to defend Korematsu, I can do it, right? So, because this is kind of what we do as lawyers. Of course, I think it's an awful, immoral decision that is deeply wrong. But if you want me to make a legal argument, I can do it, and I can do it without, I think, losing my sense of my own humanity and relationships, and then also with a professionalism of what I'm asked to perform in some ways.
Yeah. So this book's called Learning to Disagree, and in some other contexts, a phrase I've heard you use is negotiating deep difference. You use that phrase, difference. So words like difference and disagreement. I wonder if you've had the challenge from some of your readers, either of this or of other work, that a lot of your talk about kind of dealing with disagreements and, being empathetic and engaging in forgiveness is actually just kind of relativism, because like none of this stuff really matters, and there is no truth, and it's just your opinion, man. And so what do you do when you're when you're in a context where this is an area that matters, and this is the right answer, and it matters that it's the right answer? Is it unsatisfying ever to just sort of say, well, let's learn to disagree about it?
Yeah, I didn't realize this was gonna be a therapy session, because what he's not telling you is that he and I get attacked by the same people for being these squishy relativists, but we are not. So there are two moves to make here. One is just to put the question back to the person who's raising it and saying, do you really is it possible that all difference is just, flavors of ice cream? Of course not, because none of us tolerate everyone. Everybody, every person in every society sets lines, and the whole debate is what are those lines and where should they be? But no one's gonna, we're not gonna allow the South Bend chapter of Al Qaeda. We're not gonna allow the Church of Human Sacrifice. And then in your individual lives, you all could name people who you think they or their beliefs are out of bounds. So all difference matters tremendously. And then so when you have a conviction, I think actually part of the confusion around disagreement is that people aren't very clear about their own convictions, and it becomes very difficult to engage across difference or disagreement when you're not even sure what you believe or how to articulate it. I sometimes get called in to advise senior leadership or boards of organizations, and they want to say like, well, we need help clarifying our message to these external audiences, and I'm with them for 30 minutes, and I realize you all don't even agree about what your purpose is. So good luck doing that, right? You haven't even gotten clear on what you believe. And so step one is knowing what you believe and knowing how to articulate it, and then you can do that in the right settings and in the right context. You can do that with both clarity and charity. I did not mean for those to rhyme. And but the corollary is nobody needs you to weigh in on every truth or conviction that you have, right? The world does not need to hear from you on everything, and especially online. And I think a lot of us sort of are lured into thinking like our voice needs to be heard in all of these moments, and it's just not true.
What if someone's wrong on the internet?
You haven't noticed, right?
One of your chapters, I think it's called, a piece of advice is see people, not positions. Remember that, right?
Problems.
Yes. So one thing that I observed, I bet you do too, is there's a tendency sometimes in these arguments about things that matter. You and I cover a lot of this stuff in our work. Is that people hear a critical engagement with an idea, with a position. They hear it as an attack or a criticism of the person who holds the view. Well, you ever observe that, A, and then B, how do we disentangle that? Because it strikes me that that's a real obstacle to workable disagreement.
Yeah.
Everything is personal.
Yeah, so when you get to a disagreement that reaches the point of you are attacking my identity or my humanity or my person, that's a very fraught moment. And sometimes it's maybe that's not the time to double down. So I think the best way to see the broader scope of the person is to have a relationship of trust within which you are tackling hard issues, because that relationship of trust will then let both sides see that there's more to this relationship and more to both people than the particular issue that is asserted as totalizing the person or the relationship. And so I think there's no shortcut to doing that hard work of seeing the person. And then there's also, I think, the common sense piece of remembering that we're all complex human beings, and that none of this, especially when it comes to our deepest disagreements, none of this is about sort of a cognitive or logical argument alone, right? It's about a whole background of experiences and perspectives and emotions, and it's very easy to forget about that. So this is a self-indicting example that I'll share, but in this chapter on can we see people instead of problems, I just go through some ordinary examples of where sort of my type A efficiency-driven lawyer self forgets the humanity of people around me. And you will, every time I tell the story, people don't believe me. It's true though. When I was practicing in billing hours, I got in one of those fights with my wife that, these arguments that take much longer to resolve than they should. And so this was on a Saturday morning, and it took us about 4 hours to get through it. And we finally apologized and we're there. And then I looked at her and I said, do you know how much money this argument just cost us? Because I was billing that Saturday morning. And that was not what it means. Free advice, don't try that. And it was, it's a memorable example of how you cannot reduce these relationships to transactions, to efficiency, to one particular disagreement, because people are complex and spouses particularly are complex.
This is a little meta, but we mentioned earlier that you had this book, really a work of political theory on the freedom of assembly, really important book. Um, and this book strikes me as it's more personal, it's more narrative, it's a lot about kind of interpersonal relations. And then the third book, the middle one on confident pluralism, which was kind of a diagnosis, I think, of sort of society and so on. Could you talk a bit about the connections that you see between the freedom of assembly, the reality of pluralism in society, and what confidence means in that context, and the importance of interpersonally being able to disagree? It strikes me there's a connection between those three projects.
Yeah, there's a huge, thanks for noting that. There's a huge connection. I mean, everything I do intellectually in my scholarly work ties back to the right of assembly. It was what I focused on in my graduate school time. And, you know,
If nobody knows what it is, you can tell them.
I guess we should talk about it. Yeah, it really is in the First Amendment. And but at the time, I was clerking at the time, and I sort of thought of this for the first time as I looked at the text of the First Amendment and saw the right of assembly and thought, I've been to law school, I've practiced law for 4 years, I've never thought about assembly. That's really weird. And then I did some research, and nobody had written about assembly in the US context in 40 years. And the Supreme Court had not had an assembly case since the early 1980s. And that was striking, but it was also a great dissertation project. And so, my second thought was relating assembly to ecclesia and the theological context of how the New Testament church saw themselves as not part of the polity, but this counter polis, or this assembly that was different than the reigning political order. So I sort of very early on started a two-track process. One, the constitutional theoretical piece, and then in the background, a theological piece. And they always in my mind held together. And whenever I was writing publicly, whether it was common law or something else, I kept thinking, and this is entirely consistent with Christian theology, and really sort of maybe the most helpful way to think about Christian witness in our particular cultural context. The church is, I know I get in trouble when I say the church in front of Catholics, but the body of Jesus, broadly understood ecumenically, is an assembly, is the assembly. And that matters in terms of political theory and engagement with broader publics as well. And assembly, being in the text of the First Amendment, also tells us something constitutionally. It's the only right that requires more than one person to be exercised. So there's this relationality piece built into assembly that is not there anywhere else in the First Amendment. And the framers knew that, and most of our constitutional history knows that. And, you know, in the 1970s, the political theorists forgot about it, and the lawyers today have carried on that misguided tradition of individualism. And so this relationality, this groupness matters. And then it's not all upside, because the groups, or Madison called them the factions that we form, create all kinds of friction and instability and political tension. And they're a fact of the world, but they're how we exist with one another, and they're how we actually develop and in some ways strengthen our differences. And then we're stuck with them in this political order. So the second book, the first book was sort of analysis of the right assembly. The second one was, how do we live as fellow citizens in this context, theoretically, legally, civically. And then I did an intervening book with the late Tim Keller, who we were trying to make an argument distinctively for Christians about how to think about these forms of engagement with more theologically particular language. And then this last book, the new one, was more, well, can we make this even more, can I make this even more applicable to not just scholars and lawyers and students, but somebody who's trying to figure this out around the family dinner table or the workplace? I mean, are there ways to think about embodying this and living this out differently, knowing the differences aren't going away, but knowing we've got to do something about them?
So you don't just study law and religion stuff or litigate law and religion stuff, as we talked about before. You know, you've been involved in a lot of church and parachurch activities, and
you think all of my stuff is parachurch, right?
Yeah, good point. Yeah, right. Yeah, but seriously, for a separated brother, you're really active. One of your chapters is on faith, though, in this thing. And so what role is there, do you think, for faith as part of your prescription for effective disagreement?
Great. So yeah, the chapter is "Can we trust faith?" question mark. And I make a couple of arguments there. One is sort of I mean, this is not original to me by any means, but every single one of us has faith in something, and we live on these commitments to faith, whether acknowledged or not. So faith is actually a leveling principle across disagreement. You know, whoever you're talking to is displaying and resting in faith in something. It might not be a deity or transcendence, but there are acts of faith we all take, and that actually is somewhat connecting for everyone. But I think especially for Christians to be able to embody and live out a faith in a world of uncertainty, to respond with I like the word confidence much more than certainty, a confidence in faith and in the object of the faith. So you Catholics out there, I'm going to introduce you to the theologian Wesley Newbegin. Go read him. He's not going to be in your canon, but he's really important to this question about post-enlightenment confidence and not certainty. And it's quite freeing. I mean, especially in sort of the conservative evangelical right that roots itself in a fundamentalism that makes claims to certainty is philosophically untenable, but more of greater importance to me, it is a very difficult witness to bear out of that kind of a fundamentalism. And so I think the antidote of confidence, which again is not relativism, we're living our lives into the fullness of what we believe. Leslie Newbegin calls it proper confidence. That is what can anchor us in our lived experiences and with the people around us. And then I think there are really important, perhaps uniquely theological resources that people of faith can bring to our broader political discussions. I've got a chapter in the book on forgiveness. There are certainly historical examples of people who don't recognize transcendence modeling forgiveness. Nelson Mandela, probably most famously. But it's very hard for me to conceive of a discourse of forgiveness that is not grounded in faith of some kind, in an afterlife. It makes most sense to me in the Christian story where Jesus models and then commands forgiveness. But unless you can hold out the possibility of something more than the proximate and imperfect human justice of this world, then I don't know how you kind of move on in a world where we're all just hurting each other all day long. And the remainder of that, I mean, we have law and we have lawyers and judges and decision makers to bring imperfect and proximate forms of justice, but they don't come close to remedying injustice. And so this possibility of forgiveness that actually intercedes and transforms and transcends seems really important and maybe distinctly Christian.
A bunch of the folks in here are in my First Amendment class right now, and so this is going to torment them. But you use the word in one of your chapters, neutrality, and you say that there is no neutrality. And I could imagine a reader being kind of surprised, because I could imagine someone thinking when they look at the title of the book, well, you know, when you have disagreement, what you need to do is to resolve that disagreement is to find the neutral position or the neutral arbiter of that disagreement, and that's the way out of disagreement, is by finding neutrality. But you say there isn't such a thing. So what do we do?
Yeah, I want to qualify it a little bit, because there are some neutral claims, or we could say objective claims, that can be made about the world. You know, what day of the week is it? Is for most people who are in normal discourse, we could agree about the day of the week, or is the Chick-fil-A in front of us? So this is not like, we don't have to get into these weird philosophical thought experiments about is anything real, but there is a point, especially on these deeply contested issues, where it's actually helpful to recognize how much of what we're doing is not just about facts of the world, but is this very hard combination of facts and norms and experience and values all mushed together. So, you know, there was no COVID policy that was following the science full stop, right? It was a complex amalgam of epidemiology and science and policy and law and biases and all kinds of things. And I think when experts or careful thinkers or lawyers shortcut this complexity to say, I'm just giving you science or the truth or the neutral position, that's very hard to defend in most complex cases. It's not accurate in sort of describing the reality of the world, especially when it comes to any sort of human-centered policy or judgment. And so it's better, I think, just to start with a recognition that what we're doing in the world is seldom neutral. Teaching is not a neutral activity, but no one is up here in front of you objectively teaching. The really good teachers will think about their own biases and try to name them and invite discussion, but we make non-neutral decisions all the time in the classroom. Your syllabus is an extremely non-neutral decision, right? What you emphasize 7 minutes into the class period is non-neutral, and that's okay. It's just a great reminder of the complexity of what we're doing.
In addition to a lot of the narrative parts of the book, you've got kind of cases and case studies that are taken out of the case books that we often use in law school, right? The criminal law stuff, and then also First Amendment. So just as one example, one of the cases you talked about is this relatively recent Supreme Court case, the Masterpiece Cake Shop ruling. Yep. And I wonder if you could just say a bit, for those who don't know, remind people what that case is about and what happened in it. And then what does that case tell us, for better or worse, about how disagreement should go?
Yeah, who's read this Masterpiece Cake Shop? So yeah, this is the case. The gay couple is getting married. They want a cake for the wedding. The conservative evangelical baker in Denver, Colorado, doesn't want to bake the cake. He says, "I'll bake you a cake for any other day of the year, but not for your wedding." And so you put me in front of Pojanowski to answer this question too, but I do think Justice Kennedy's opinion in that case is not as clear as it could have been.
You're a little harsher in the book.
You should go read the opinion again, and it's not giving us a lot of operational legal principles. It's talking about, and there's a sentiment behind it that is actually quite endearing. As I summarize it in the book, I read him to be saying, gay people are nice, Christians are nice, the Colorado Commission wasn't nice, we should all try to be nice. And that might be true, but it's very hard to have a constitutional principle based on be nice. And so I think it's a model of maybe how you can't do this. But a related point I make, and I remember as this case was coming through the courts, when you read the contemporaneous media coverage on the two sides of the issue, and there were very much different sides, there was just zero empathy in the other direction. So anyone who was sort of siding with the baker was saying, this gay couple, a bunch of activists, they don't really care about this. They're just out to harm Christians. And in the other direction, it was the sense like this bigot is making up his beliefs. He clearly doesn't have a conviction about them. And there was one, I actually can't locate it. There was one profile in the Denver Post. There was this exercise in empathy that looked at both of the litigants and said, these are real human beings, and this is a complex case. And then when you actually apply the law to the case, it becomes even harder. And there are lots of issues, and then line drawing issues. And I sometimes say, when I teach this class to my own students, I say, figure out what your own normative inclination is about this case. And wherever you are, if you think the guy should have had to bake the cake, then what do you do with the wedding singer, right? Are you going to make the wedding singer perform a song in a wedding that goes against his or her convictions? Or alternatively, if you think that the cake baker should prevail here, then what about the bed and breakfast owner or the Marriott for that? And how does law, policy, and normative intuition align with what you're trying to take out of this case? And so, but part of what I'm trying to do there is to say, let's start with basic empathy that can show us why there are two sides to this case. There are two fairly plausible views of the world that make arguments, and then the courts have to decide that there are going to be winners and losers, and then how you win and how you lose also matters. And I don't think, we are all going to be winners and losers in this political society at some point or another about some issue that we care about, and democracy itself has to be an ongoing conversation about those decisions. And if we just try to win at all costs, crush the other side, and have no empathy or sympathy, over time, we're not going to form ourselves into a very healthy polity.
One of the topics that that we both teach in our First Amendment classes is the issue of accommodations and exemptions from general laws, right? This comes up in all kinds of contexts, including, I guess, the cake shop case, right? It strikes me that cases about accommodations and exemptions, in a way, are cases about disagreement, because you've got a general law that's validly enacted that presumably represents the view of most people, or at least a majority, and then you've got some people, probably a minority, who disagree with it and don't want to have to comply with it. So how do you, the issue that comes up in every accommodations case is how to resolve this disagreement. Now, again, you talk a lot about narrative and good habits and empathy and forgiveness. Let's be kind of law geeky here. What are the judicially administrable doctrines that could help as a political community help us to navigate these kinds of disagreements, the ones that are present in the accommodations case?
Yeah, it's very hard for me to issue or to answer that from just a doctrinal lens, because the background political theory and cultural context matters so much. So this is an ongoing discussion that you and I and many of our friends have. But what is the cultural salience of arguing for unique protections for the free exercise of religion in a contemporary society where more and more people are rejecting the premise, not of exemptions, but of religion? So free exercise has a lot more salience in 1880, when most of the country believes in some kind of monotheistic faith. It's a lot harder sometimes to say, because if you're on the other side of this issue, you're going to start saying, why should they get special treatment for their, what if I like football? That's my highest belief in order in life. Then why don't I get a day off of work if they get a day off for Sunday worship or whatever it is? And I think so. There again, I'm not going to get to sort of a doctrinal principle that you want, because the question, as you know, is super complicated. But I think the question is, can we start with a recognition of why someone else would be deeply suspicious of a claim to an exemption, rather than starting with, I see sometimes in litigation when people just quote Madison and say, like, QED, Madison said creator God is our highest value, and therefore we should have religious exemptions. And that might have worked in 1793, but it's just not going to work today. So if you care about religious exemptions, what are the arguments you can make that are going to appeal to an increasingly pluralistic society, judiciary, and others, legislators, who are not necessarily going to buy the premise?
But if it was Aquinas and not Madison, it would be set.
Well, you might think so.
So here's another kind of real world type case that you and I encountered, and again, that I think really can be described in terms of disagreement. So these are fights about religious symbols in public places.
Yeah.
Right? We were just talking about this in my class. You and I are familiar with a lot of these, whether it's Christmas displays or the 10 Commandments, or most recently, a 30-something foot high war memorial cross. Somebody objects to it. I disagree with the message being communicated by that. I disagree that sign speaks for me and for my experience. How does a political community navigate, or let alone resolve, that kind of disagreement? There is no neutrality. Every political community is going to use symbols of some kind. If people disagree about them, what do you do?
Yeah, this is great, because I think you and I disagree on this point, so we will now model that. I mean, the religious symbol stuff is kind of less interesting to me, because I think on both sides, the litigants sort of tee up these issues to get fundraising and attention. But in the related context of the Establishment Clause cases, with something like what the court has called legislative prayer, most recently unfolding in the context of a local municipal council, and can you have a prayer before the municipal legislative meeting? And my own view is, and again, this is appropriately sociologically and culturally, historically contextualized. So back in the day, there might have been a time when almost everybody was a Christian or a believer of some faith, and a kind of a bland sectarian prayer might make sense. I just think it's a lot harder to do today, and I'm not sure why people of faith need that prayer. I mean, just, you can pray before the meeting or pray, but that sort of you're right that the space will always be filled by something, but if you really believe like the God you worship is the creator of the universe and that it all works out in the end, then I don't think he's going to need like the prayer inserted in the formal meeting. And there's a cost of having that prayer inserted. I think it's Justice Sotomayor in her dissent in Town of Greece who really points this out, that, I actually have quoted her before as an example of this empathy. Like, put yourself in the shoes of the person who doesn't believe in God, who is subjected to this prayer right before the hearing on their variance request or whatever it is. That actually that could be a pretty unsettling situation, right? And if you can't empathize with that, then if you are a Christian, put yourself in front of the municipal council that is uh, run by the Wiccans or whoever it is. And do you want that sort of liturgical gesture done right before your own plea to the council? Or if your kid's in school, do you want that prayer to start off the school day? And I would say no. I mean, pray at home, pray before you go, but you don't need to. In a society where the conditions of pluralism have us deeply divided about ultimate things and where there's not much of a consensus, then I think the fight for sort of space in the public square is maybe short-sighted and maybe not as empathetic as we could be.
So you used the word consensus. So now I want you to explain in 5 minutes or less why Alistair McIntyre is better than John Rawls.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. Well, first of all, you should all read McIntyre. I mean, this is amazing. You are in the same institution as Alistair McIntyre. I'm so envious here. Yeah, I know. Believe me, I'll get there. And I'm 5 minutes here. I'm gonna back into this with a broader reference. I did a talk on this book at my home institution on Monday, and there was a really smart political theorist who, the moderator invited them all to critique the book, which I thought was like not a very friendly way to launch it. But there was a very smart political theorist colleague of mine who said, my biggest concern or question about this book is I don't think you've articulated your theory of disagreement. Why is it that you think we have disagreement? And if you don't articulate the theory, then how is your solution going to be? Depending on what the state of the world is, that might give you different tactics and practices. And he said, I think your theory of disagreement is that we don't have enough empathy, and that we don't understand the complexity of each other's arguments. And I responded by saying it is much bleaker than that. It's magnitude and meaning. Like, we have actually lived into different practices and that really inform our epistemology to such a degree that it's very difficult anymore even to find ways to translate to each other over some of these deep differences. That is a massive political problem, and it is only going to get worse. So I actually am, in the work I'm trying to do, including a book like this, I'm trying to give a second best solution to a very hard problem for which I cannot figure out a first best solution. And the second best solution is work on empathy, try to understand complexity. And I actually, my hunch here is that almost in sort of an intuitive sense that we still can connect as human beings, find the fuller picture of who that person is, not just this issue they represent or the party they represent, work to find lots of common ground in ordinary things, and that can mitigate some of our deep differences, but it's not going to overcome them. And the theory of disagreement is much, much harder than just finding more empathy. And I think McIntyre is very good about impressing upon us the dilemma that we now find ourselves in, and that if there is a way out of this dilemma, it starts with an accurate description and understanding of the world that we're living in, which is very hard to do in a Rawlsian world, or frankly, like a law school world.
Questions from any of you? Comments for John?
You mentioned briefly kind of grades in schools. I think that you kind of brought it up in. I think in this kind of question of really disagree, I think that schools tend to be like this kind of the big fault lines when it comes to these kind of culture war issues, because it's much more personal when you're thinking about views of the world where, how are you indoctrinating kids one way or the other? So what would you say is kind of the answer to that? I mean, I know that that's kind of.
Yeah, no, it's, Rick? No, yeah, yeah, it's not bad. I mean, I do think school choice has to be part of it. And I think there are, sometimes I think of this in the context of institutional pluralism. There have to be options for people who want to have dissenting and different communities and experiences of formation for themselves and for their kids. And this comes at a cost. So a related example, it's not exactly what you brought up. My friend David French often gets hit by both political directions for taking principled stands. And the latest one was he made an argument that California trying to take away the parental rights of kids who don't want to have their kids exposed to transgender views on the one hand, and then Texas, who wants to take the parental rights away from parents who do want their kids exposed to those ideologies. You can't, I think a pluralistic David French kind of Inazu way to this is you have to be consistent. And that consistency is going to admit, depending on what your belief is about that side of that issue, it's going to admit harm and tragedy in the world. But it seems to me the only alternative to that is just to say my side has to win and I've got to control the political process. And that seems not a very good, healthy political system. Oh, stumbled on it.
I'm struck by your conversation on faith in policymaking, and so I'm sort of curious how you think political disagreements would change, or potentially, I mean, obviously not disappear altogether, but just sort of be mitigated if we took out faith-based justifications for different policies.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, there are some limit cases here. I mean, whatever Alabama's doing with IVF and all that seems kind of bonkers to me. But in terms of sort of justifying the legal decision and Alabama's commitment to Jesus, which I just don't understand. But the other side of the spectrum, which I think is equally important and probably in law school settings and legal practice settings even more pervasive, is the sense that those faith people are doing faith stuff and the rest of us are acting reasonable. That's just not true, right? Everybody is smuggling deep normative commitments into their policy preferences. And so the classes that I teach on political philosophy are sort of somewhat designed to just call this question. And this, nobody's going into the voting booth and making the rational, reasonable decision while the religious people are just resting on their ancient beliefs. I mean, we're all making extremely complex and loaded decisions. So I say bring it all in, but then also try to have the discourse be better than Alabama's doing.
Thank you. As I was thinking about what you're talking about today, to disagree, we have to be engaging within one another. And I wonder if you would say that there's ever a time where disengagement is justified or the right thing to do, or whether we should always continue to come back. Like you mentioned the unboard comment in your class, and you had to keep coming back to class because that's what you have to do when you're a student. But anywhere else, we can walk away from
Yeah.
When is that helpful or not?
Yeah, so that brings up answers on a number of different levels. So on a sociological or social level, should groups ever walk away, right? Should you just kind of cloister yourselves or withdraw from society? And maybe the answer is sometimes, but I would think probably not now for most people in this country. On an individual level, can and should you walk away? Definitely, right? So there are going to be some relationships that are just harmful or traumatic, or there's power involved, and it's not going to do you any good to keep trying. And there are some people who are just going to be arguing in bad faith, and you're not going to have the energy to keep up with it. Now, hopefully, that's not most of the relationships in your life. So you have to, I think, work to discern. But sometimes walking away is important, and sometimes just giving breathing space from a relationship is important. And then the related point, I think, is sometimes it's just important to go back to a much more basic human connection and just drop. This is especially true with family, right? If your goal is to get Uncle Fred to change his vote by November, it's probably not going to happen, right? So play a much longer game and figure out if you care about the relationship, what does this relationship look like? How do we establish and reestablish trust? And how do we set in motion a kind of dialogue that's going to unfold in a period of years and not just months or weeks.
So, building on that question, what do you think, just as a general matter, of the kind of, one of the arguments that's often made for federalism type arrangements is precisely that it makes possible at least some, short of secession, limited type disengagement, but from one political community from another that has different values. Is that a plausible way of thinking about it, do you think?
I mean, I think in theory, that seems like it has a lot of upsides. It's a lot harder to know how to do that in our increasingly connected society, especially online. I mean, the online stuff is just blowing up the First Amendment that we've had in place for centuries, because it's very hard to think about how you limit discourse or beliefs or actions when anyone can get anything anywhere, even across different countries. I think, but in principle, the idea that you can localize decisions and authority on autonomy makes good sense to me in most cases. We have obviously historically bad examples of that as well, but in many cases, and then especially when you're looking for positive exemplars, don't start with Congress, right? You're not going to get a lot of great examples from our national discourse and our national bodies, but start with the people who are in your life, who are forced to engage across their deep differences on a very pragmatic level because they have to fix the road or something like that.
Just a follow-up to your question, which I thought was really good. And what you're talking about, the possibility of walking away or coaching and so on. What about the opposite when society shuns a smaller group? It seems like there's definitely a very valuable place for that, but we don't dialogue with neo-Nazis. No one thinks we should. Everyone just says, just kick them out of society, don't give them jobs, don't talk to them, treat them badly, and most of them will stop being neo-Nazis, which seems to work pretty well. And is that just a practical question of like, this group is small enough and has bad enough views that we can ostracize them? Or would you say the right limits or use of that?
Yeah, I won't be able to answer that question with particularity because it's complicated and always changing. But I have a chapter in here where I ask the question, where's the line between wrong and evil? And I think at some point we have to state as a fact of the world that there are evil beliefs and evil groups that we don't want to be part of our polite society. We don't want the Nazis part of that. But our tendency right now is that we tend to lump way too many people into that evil category. And when everybody who disagrees with you becomes evil, that's very hard to sustain. Partly because when you think someone's just wrong, you still think that you can hold out the possibility of persuading them, and there's an invitation to dialogue. But if you think they're evil, really what you want to do is shut them down and minimize their influence. And right now we're seeing that line blow up more and more for lots of people.
Just as a quick follow-up, what about when the evil group is large enough that they have significant influence in society, which I think people on both sides would point to particular, at least subgroups, like you might have a conservative pointing to extreme leftists or a liberal pointing to more extreme right wingers or something like that. But they are part of the national conversation, kind of do need to interact with them to have a functioning society.
I mean, if it's true evil, and if it has risen to that level of our populace, then we've got much bigger fish to fry than talking about how to disagree. I hope that we are not there yet. But so you have to fight and resist evil, and you have now also for those of you who are Christians, every person is also an image bearer, so that complicates the claims of evil, right? People hold evil beliefs and do evil things. People are also all image bearers. That's hard to put into practice, but a theological claim. But you have to resist evil, and then you also have to do the hard work of figuring out what is just wrong, misguided, and harmful, but not evil.
So first of all, thank you for this talk and for pointing out, you're absolutely right that most people are too quick to label the other as evil. And so within that frame of mind, I'm hearing you say truth, or rather trust is sort of the lubricant of disagreement. How do we get to trust? Is it proximity? Is that maybe the main root?
Yeah, proximity, time, relationship, commitment, patience, thick skin, all of that. And there's just no shortcut to it. And we're we're not collectively doing this very well. But I think if you're increasingly worried like I am about the social level of the problem, then I think the only fix starts at the individual level, modeling it for each other in our relationships and working to do it better. And there are, we keep hearing the bad stories. There are good stories and good examples of this too. So I think telling the right stories also matters here.
All the way to the back.
Hi, thank you so much for your time today. There's some dialogue about how people should stay separate and just like be where they're comfortable. And I'm not talking about like race or religion or anything like that. I'm just talking about like fundamental beliefs. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on
Yeah,
that theory.
I think, especially in places like this, no, right? I mean, this has, like, you should bring your full selves into these conversations and with the opportunity and the privilege of being able to have robust discussions, you should talk these things through. I mean, if we can't figure out how to do it in places like Notre Dame and WashU, then where else in society are we going to expect people to talk about these things? So I think, yes, recognize why all of this matters and why all of this is sort of in some ways inseparable from who we are. And then at the same time, especially for lawyers in training, figure out how your professional skills and tools and language makes that or positions that differently so that you can say, I can still walk into my classroom and say that I am a Christian or I am, fill in the blank. And yet we can also be professionals and talk through hard issues in more of a clinical sense.
Hey there, thanks for coming. I'm curious how you view your role as a professor, encouraging, constructive disagreement, and like if there's any practical tips you have about like being a law professor, being in a position of power where like you control the conversation in the classroom. I've been thankful to see many good examples of it here at Notre Dame. I've also talked to friends at other law schools who've told me about very bad examples. And so I'm curious like how you go about that, if you have any practical tips, because most of us in here are going to be lawyers and going to be in positions of power that are able to guide a conversation. So I'm curious if you have any tips.
Yeah, I think recognizing the power dynamic is actually a really important first step, and a lot of people don't. So I talk here and elsewhere about some of the sort of civic aspirations we need to live into, like being more patient, being more humble, being more tolerant. I think that's sometimes asymmetrical. If you're in the position of power, the burden is more on you to do those things sometimes. Now, power is also a very tricky thing. It can change in an instant. I mean, you're right to name sort of a power differential between professors and students in most contexts, but I've been in some unpleasant protests that have erupted in the moment, and in that moment, I do not have the power, and it's very clear to everyone. So that power and how we steward power is complicated. I also think that there's a very hard line to, and I know enough of your professors here to know that lots of people here do it well, but to be a human being and to show the appropriate level of vulnerability without overdoing it and without, we're not here to be your buddies. We're here to teach you. And yet also we are complex, imperfect human beings, and trying to pull that off in the right way is incredibly hard sometimes. So look for that in your own life as well. And then I think there's a kind of discernment about when to I feel like as a professor, I have different modes and roles I play. Sometimes I need to be very critical and push, and sometimes I almost have to be more pastoral and just, walk alongside or listen. And it depends on a whole lot of things, including who's in the room, what's happening in the world, and that sort of thing. And that's going to be true in legal practice as well. You're going to have to change mid-course quite a few times when you recognize that the person across from you is experiencing something far differently than you thought they were.
So Tanner was asking you to reflect a bit on, your role as a law professor and how you do some of the things that you talk about in the book. Maybe we can just close with, do you have kind of a concluding bit of advice for law students? Some of these students are 1L, some are 3Ls, all the way in between. But if you kind of had to pull one thing out of the book, and I know you want them to buy the book, what's the big takeaway for how to to follow your advice in the context of being a law student?
Yeah, so I talk about it, one of the chapters talks about fairness and how do you know what fairness is? And the example I use is in the law school classroom. All of you are here and, you know, you're paying money and you're spending time to be here, but you're just one person in a community of other people who are trying to pull this off. So the fairness question in the classroom is how much should you be engaging? How much should you be monopolizing the class? And this is not generalizable because it will differ for each of you, but have the self-awareness to know that if you're the person who talks too much and is using too much of your time, to dial that back, and have the self-awareness to know if you're in the other direction and you actually need more courage to speak, then to do more of that. And I think the best way to self-diagnose is actually to have friends who speak truth into your life to tell you, and take that way beyond the classroom as well. But as you move on in your careers, surround yourself with the people who will speak truthfully about who you are and how you need to grow as a person.
Thanks all of you for coming, and thanks, John.